Okay, so this is the start of chapter 3, and I'll warn you from the outset that this is probably this chapter is incredibly important. It's incredibly important in several ways. First, it's important because it's probably the one thing that people remember from this course. Whether they remember it accurately or not is a different issue, but it is the one thing that people tend to remember from this course, which is a good thing because this is a incredibly important topic. It's also probably the hardest chapter and longest chapter in this first part of the course, and it's also the most important chapter to understand for the first exam. On the first exam, this chapter will get the most questions. And it's basically this notion of supply and demand, with the basic idea that economists then need a model to understand how firms trying to do what they do best, which is produce the good, try to maximize profit, consumers trying to spend as least as possible to maximize their happiness. The end result of that, if I can kind of provide a little bit of a preview here, is that you end up getting a market. Let's say it's a market for pens, where I put the price of pens on the y-axis, the quantity of pens on the x-axis, and we talk about the demand curve being downward sloping and the supply curve being upward sloping, and that there's a point where they meet in this market that gives us a price and quantity that's known as the equilibrium price and quantity. So by the end of this chapter, this picture right here should make a lot more sense. The reason why I'm showing it to you right now, though, is so that you understand why we are doing it. Well, the first reason would be, as we said in chapter 1, economists really love markets. And this is the way that we graphically understand, that economists graphically understand how markets exist. And the reason why they are important is because now producers doing what they want, consumers doing what they want, end up coming to some sort of agreement. And that ends up dictating how much is produced and consumed and what the price of those pens will be. And that's the suppliers and the demanders, the producers and the consumers, agreeing to those points. Not that it's dictated to them or handed down to them. They are deciding these things. And that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter. Okay. As we said, talking about markets, the supply curve, the demand curve, and the point where the two of them meet, that equilibrium point. Or where supply equals demand. Because this is a long chapter, I don't want this video will probably be the longest of this entire course. I'm just going to skip ahead here to the actual material here. The reason why this model of supply and demand, and it is a model, so it's an abstraction from reality. The reason why these models are important is because they allow economists then to predict what will happen in that market, what we'll get as a supply and demand in that market. And what does it mean to have a market? It means that we're generally talking about a single product. And in that single product, we are talking about those buyers and sellers interacting or transacting with one another. A market for pens. But it could be a market for pens in Hawaii. It could be a market for pens globally. It could be a market for pens for lawyers. It could be, right? I mean, I can limit that market as much as I want. I can more further define the market, or I can have the market be broader in scope. We just have to be precise about what we mean by the market. The example that was talked about just a little bit earlier here, I believe right here, was talking about bottled water and talking about how people in the 80s and especially in the 90s, started wanting to buy bottled water, and how there's this trend actually to reduce that, right, and start going back to tap water. And that's what this picture is showing right here, right, is that the market explodes and it's growing even further, and that now there's those attempts to reduce the size of this market, at least a little bit. There are the other issues as well, besides like the market for bottled water. We could talk about markets for pet products. That, you know who you are. There are some people that really love their pets and will buy their pets anything and everything. Treats and fancy trips and all those great things. The cats and the dogs aren't obviously buying those things. That would be the consumers are buying those things. Their owners are. I don't know, maybe pet people don't like them being called owners. The cohabitators with the pets are the ones that are buying the things. Right, that market is growing. So we could talk about that market and how that exists with prices and with quantities. Prices are so important. Prices are the way that they are the incentive for firms and consumers, right? Let me kind of give you some examples here of how I think as an economist. Because I think on some level that's what this course is designed to do, is get you to think like an economist. I drive a regular car. By that I mean it's not a hybrid, it's not an electric car, it's a regular car. I put gasoline into it, and I have to fill the tank like once a week. It's not unusual to me. Like, it's just what I do. Now, the question would be is, why don't I buy an electric car, right? It seems to be certainly a cool, trendy thing to do. But the reason why I don't is that, I don't know, I don't think that gasoline prices are that high, right? I mean, I don't know. I paid $2.20 a gallon. If I wanted to have an electric car, I'd have to buy a new car. That new car would then require electricity, which, yes, I'd have to pay for the electricity, but the idea is that it would cost less than the gasoline. But not that much less. And when you combine into it, again, the fact that this electric car is pretty expensive, I might have to replace the battery once a decade or so, whereas I could just keep buying gas at $2.19 a gallon and not have to change my current car. Which means that as a consumer, I don't face, based on the price of gasoline, I don't face much of an incentive. Now, what if the price of gasoline went to $15 a gallon? Well, then I obviously face a very different incentive, and I very well might buy that electric vehicle, right? We can think about this with other things as well, right? Prices, again, they tell us so much about, they influence how the consumers make the decisions, but they also influence what the sellers decide to sell. Right? Building on this theme of car manufacturing, the car manufacturers aren't selling little cars as much because they don't make as much money from them. Right? They don't make as much from a Corolla as they can from a Tacoma. Right? A truck. And so Toyota wants to sell trucks because they can get much higher prices for them, right? That price sends a signal to Toyota that they should really push trucks. And if they have to sell cars, they're going to probably want to really sell the Prius, right? Like a hybrid car that they can get a lot more money from than a Corolla, right? And again, no one is telling Toyota what they have to do, that they need to sell fuel-efficient vehicles or that they should sell large vehicles, just like no one is telling me, the consumer, what kind of car I have to buy. The prices do that. The prices tell us what we should do. And those prices exist in that market, and those prices are the signal for what consumers and businesses should do, and those signals come to us from that market, from that supply and demand curve, right? And what that means is that the consumer has to fulfill two conditions. Is that two things have to be happening. Is that both the consumer has to be willing to buy the good at that price and have enough money to be able to pay that price, and that the producer, when they're offered that price, has to be willing and able to produce that product. Right? And there are some prices that even though I could pay for it, right, I wouldn't be willing to pay for it, right? An example of that would be like a $3,000 computer. You know, I could probably come up with $3,000 to buy a computer. So I'm able to do it, but I'm not willing to pay that much for a computer. And there's other ways as well, right? Like, I'd be willing, right, to pay, I don't know, $10,000 for my own fast jet, right? But I don't even have the $10,000, right, to kind of pay for that kind of thing. Or $100,000, right? I don't know how much jets cost. I'm sure they cost more than $10,000. But the whole point of the matter is that I just gave you two different things, right? One product that I was able to afford but wouldn't want to pay that price, and the other one where I'd be willing to pay that price, but I don't have that kind of money. One is reflecting sort of my preferences, and one is reflecting my income levels. For the producer, they have to, again, it has to kind of fulfill their preferences, and they have to have a technical ability to produce the product at that price. Both of these will come true within the market setting. And that's where we see that. The prices then, this is our checkpoint here, is that the market is the institution where we see those prices. The markets can be different. We just have to define how those markets are going to exist. But there's a great deal of information that we get from those prices. When we put that all together, we get what's called the price system. And that price system, again, is the signals between the producers and the consumers. And there we go. I jumped ahead a little bit, but again, I just get so excited by this. When we're talking about the consumer and what they decide to do, if we add up all the consumers together, we get a market demand curve. So consumer 1 plus consumer 2 plus ... equals the market demand curve, right? If I just add in all of the different consumers together. Each consumer has a highest value that they'd be willing to pay. Well, that's going to be then part of the demand curve. The demand curve is going to basically have these points where I'm willing to pay those prices. Why am I willing to pay it? I feel like it's worth it, right? I just demonstrated to you on the previous slides that I was unwilling to pay $3,000 for a computer, because my use of a computer doesn't involve anything that requires a $3,000 computer, so I don't think it's worth it. What do I think, right? Me personally, the way I use my computer, I don't know, $300, $400, that's about the most I'm willing to pay. That reflects how much I think it's worth. That's my willingness to pay. So if I start to see prices higher than that, I'm not willing to pay them. That's not going to be part of my demand curve. And that's what we see right here, right? Those who have that lower willingness to pay are not going to buy them. Now, there are people, though, that will spend that do gaming and whatnot, that will want to buy that kind of computer. But that's not going to include everyone, right? And it goes the other way as well, right? That there are some people who would not buy a $300 computer because it doesn't fit their needs, right? They have higher needs than that. Goes both ways, right? The whole point is that the demand curve takes those things into account with that willingness to pay principle. And then when the consumer actually does purchase the product, to purchase the product means that you're fulfilling the condition that they were willing to pay for it. Or that at least they were willing to pay for it. So to purchase the product means what it means is that if I purchase the product, that means that the price then must be less than or equal to my willingness to pay for the item. I would not buy it if the price was more than my willingness to pay for the item. And that leads us then to our demand curve. The demand curve then is a function that describes the relationship between the quantity of the product and the price that I'm paying. And what we see from that demand curve is a law of demand that basically describes the fact that the demand curve is typically downward sloping. Or in other words, that I'll buy more of the product as the price falls. In my pens market, where I have the price on the y-axis, the quantity of pens on the x-axis, what the law of demand says is that this is a downward sloping demand curve, that demand curves are downward sloping. And that basically as the price falls, more is purchased. Which makes sense because as I keep lowering the price, I keep getting additional consumers who have that now lower willingness to pay. So as the price goes down, people buy more. What the law of demand describes for us is a movement along the curve from A to B to C to D to E. The law of demand describes that movement. As the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. Quantity demanded, Q subscript D. I'll repeat that again and be careful about my words and make sure you listen to my words here very carefully. That as the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. As the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. And that's what you see in this demand curve. And these next few slides are basically going to repeat what I'm saying here, but you'll see it multiple times, which isn't the worst thing in the world. There we go. This is our law of demand. Law of demand is seen in this downward sloping demand curve where the price is falling and my quantity is rising. Law of demand, showing that inverse relationship between the two. I don't know what more I can say about this slide. Hopefully this should be pretty obvious if you've been listening to the video now at this point. Price on my vertical axis, quantity of the product that we're talking about in this market is on the horizontal axis, or I could say the y-axis and the x-axis, and that this is an inverse relationship. Again, this is, now it should be said, this is unique to the market that we are talking about. So I can't talk about all prices for all products and all the quantities for those products. I'm limiting it to, again, the pens market, where I could talk about price of pens and quantity of pens. We can't describe multiple markets in a demand curve. Demand curves are limited to one single market. And what that market demand curve then does is it sums up all the individual demand curves. So again, kind of what we're saying here is that for me, here's my demand curve. Jeff, I don't know, I came up with the name, my friend from college. Here's his demand curve. My son Truman, here's his demand curve. He doesn't really have demand, he's 2. The idea here is that here are 3 individuals all needing pens. He doesn't really need pens. What we do here is sum them all up add them all up for me, for Jeff, and for my son Truman, add them all up to get a market demand curve. So that the price, when we say sum them up horizontally, essentially what we're saying here is that at price, let's say $1, that if the quantity is 5 and the quantity is 10 and the quantity is 20, then this should be quantity 35. So what is all in this demand curve? That's kind of the next question to this. And here we're saying that demand is a function of multiple things. Remember this part right here? Hold other factors constant. Remember that from chapter 1? That's my ceteris paribus assumption. And what we're then saying is that demand is a function of all of these variables plus the price. That demand is a function of, that's all that this fancy looking F is saying of it, is that demand for pens is a function of the price of pens, and then each of these things. If we're just talking about the price, that's our law of demand. So with this variable here, we're just talking about, right, we saw this here. Here's my demand function. Here's my P, here's my Q. That when I change the price, I change the quantity demanded. Or I have a movement along the curve. Right, that's my law of demand. These other variables, taste preferences, income, prices, buyers, future expectations, when these things, let's add this here. So to say law of demand. We're using the ceteris paribus assumption. In that law of demand. So we say, for law of demand, we say ceteris paribus, or holding all of these things constant. Ceteris paribus, holding all of these things constant, that when the price changes, the quantity demanded changes in the opposite direction. Right. Ceteris paribus, holding these things constant, price and quantity change in the opposite directions. When we change these things, this is when we shift the curve rather than move along the curve. Meaning, when I change these other factors, I no longer use ceteris paribus. And that because of that, then I can shift outwards the demand curve, or I can shift inwards the demand curve by changing one of these things. This is a very important slide, slide 20. You may want to listen to this slide 20 description 2 or 3 times to fully take in what I've all just said. The next few slides will kind of, what I tend to do here is I tend to focus a lot of things on one single slide, and then we can kind of talk more about the detail in a little bit. I've said an awful lot of details about this slide. I'd encourage you to watch this little bit, the 2-3 minutes I spent on this slide. Watch it again and again and again, because this is very important. A fairly large number of questions I ask you on this chapter are going to come from this single slide, and distinguishing the difference between movements versus shifts. Do you understand that there's a difference between the two? And then what happens now over these slides, these next, 5 slides, we're now going to change each of these. All I can say about these slides is, I didn't make them, so it's, for what it's worth, I didn't make them. Don't blame me. Yet I am your instructor, so ultimately I'm the only thing you can blame, so you should blame something. The authors really should have made some pictures to go along with this. They didn't. Well, I'll have to add the pictures for you. Not that big a deal. So what we're doing here is we're going now through each of these other factors that can affect demand and shift the demand curve. So let's call these something, I don't know. I'm making this up. I'm not making this up. I'm making this term up. Let's call it shift factor number 1. What is one type of thing, if we go back to this slide right here, right? What's this first thing that could possibly cause a shift in the curve? Right? That shift in the curve Again, shifts being caused by any of these things. This is shift factor number 1. Number 3, number 4, number 5. So let's talk about shift factor number 1. Taste and preferences. It's a pretty easy one. Essentially what we're saying here is that certain factors, one of the things that affects my demand for a product would be what my taste and preferences are for that product. When people buy a phone, people don't want just a phone that can only make phone calls, right? Or we think that they are tragically hip if that's all they want the phone to do. Most people want a phone that can give them maps and they can text and send videos and do all lots of cool things. Well, that's a taste and preference. And those tastes and preferences change. And if we can think back to all the phones, right? Like, think back to the phones, the first phones that many of us got was like the Razor phone or maybe even a BlackBerry. Right? Those were cool phones, but they were kind of like slimline phones that didn't do very much. And then eventually you got an Android. Or eventually you got an iPhone, right? That now has changed our tastes and preferences for those kinds of products. Who knows what it will be 10 years from now? And certainly the people at Apple and all the makers of Android phones are certainly concerned about that. What that would mean is that we could understand this in two ways. I could have more preference for that product or a greater taste for that product. That's going to be reflected by a rightward shift or an increase in demand. Or I could have my demand curve and I could have a shift to the left. Where I could have a decrease in demand or a shift to the left of the curve.